I'm going to talk a little bit about history, briefly, how cities got to where they are today, the current trends in cities that we're seeing, particularly around mobility and land use. I'm going to talk about the new technologies that we see coming to the fore. And we're going to also talk about maybe some of the more utopian possibilities for cities and some dystopian possibilities. But before we get there, I'd like to talk about why our work's so important. Whether you're somebody like myself that's worked in the public sector or you work in real estate, it doesn't really matter, public or private sector. We have a lot of influence over the world. And fundamentally, we all love our cities that we live in. And we share them with other people. We share them with nature. And they create huge economic opportunities for people. And the cities that were not Tier 1 cities, that's okay, because there's a huge opportunity to leapfrog some of the mistakes that, for instance, we've made in the United States. So I'm going to talk about that as well. I'm also personally very motivated by the climate change problem and the fact that we are seeing continually a rise in temperatures across the world that has profound effects on the way we live and potentially the way our children will live. We also have natural resource shortages that are a serious issue, particularly if you live in a warmer climate. This is the real deal. Water is the new gold. And let's be honest, the scientists have been too conservative in their predictions. We keep finding out that things are actually looking worse than we thought. Just because people are continuing to lend money, right, and just because they're continuing to insure does not mean that this is real. I think we learned that in 2008. And the fact is we have some serious problems with pollution. This is when Beijing banned cars for a bit before the Olympics. Quite a stark difference, isn't it? And I'm happy to announce, I just saw this story yesterday, this is good news, that actually transportation is the biggest contributor now to greenhouse gas effect. That's a big plus. That means we've actually gotten control, to some extent, of our energy problem. But we have to be honest with people, and we have to be honest with ourselves about the cost-benefit of the choices that we make every single day. And here's the bad news and the good news. The bad news is, and my wife actually has worked on this, human beings have a very hard time comprehending something as big as climate change, getting ready to crash down on them. But we are starting to understand the economic impacts, and I actually think that's good news. The Koch brothers actually recently joined the EPA Energy Star program, so that's progress. The other thing that motivates me, I'm sorry to be bumming you guys out, but don't worry, it gets better. We have a global health crisis in terms of fatalities on our roads because of our transportation choices. And we lose this many people per year on our roads worldwide. In fact, it's the #1 killer of young people, period, across the world. It's not AIDS, it's not cancer, it's auto death. Okay, let's talk about what we can learn quickly from history. For one thing, we've been on the earth for 200,000 years. We've been in cities in our current condition for about 10,000 years. And cities really haven't changed that much. I mean, obviously they've changed, but in terms of the way we organize ourselves, near water, with some sort of barrier, everything being a 5 to 10 minute walk or horse ride at that point, it wasn't that much different. What we've learned just in the last 2 years with studies that have come out is actually the productivity level of ancient cities increased dramatically with infill development, just as it does today. It's not really that much different. But the difference is we've grown by 350% in the last 115 years. Let's look at how the streets were before the second phase, let's say, of the Industrial Revolution. People ruled the streets. Congestion was not a bad word. Congestion was a good thing. The more congestion you had, the busier people were. The sharing economy was real back then as it is today. It was just different. It wasn't technology enabled. People rode bikes in places like Manila to get around, to get to work. In the 80s, people in Beijing still primarily got around by bike to get to school or to work. I didn't realize this until I got to Manila the other day, but streetcars were a big part of life. In Singapore, the streets belonged to people, and they had a mixed environment on the streets until the car came along. So this is all very important to understand our future. In the US, we had the Federal Highway Act. We started building into our cities. We built a lot of suburbs. We sold people the American dream, and then we exported it all around the world. And transit became very ineffective because transit became very slow when the automobile was introduced into the equation. And of course, we left the jobs downtown, and we've doubled down on that in the US, and it has not worked well for us. So let's talk about what's happening in cities now. So what's happening is we are getting very dense. We're urbanizing at a rapid pace. And this is that famous intersection in Japan. I'm blanking on the name. It has the busiest Starbucks in the entire world. 2,500 people can cross at the same time at this intersection. That's good for business. Urbanization's on the rise, big time. But what's fascinating is in the US, it's leveled off. You look at a place like Shanghai. So first of all, this is a problem that we do not understand in the United States. You can only fit so many people through in single occupancy vehicles. It just doesn't work. Now, in Shanghai, in the time that in America we would spend just planning, let's say a subway, you've built an entire city. And I heard from Rob Spire this morning that you're going to 600 metro stations. That's something that we're not doing in the US, and we could learn from Asia. I was in Singapore recently. The transit system there, just built over the last few decades, is incredibly impressive and supports a lot of growth. So one trend we are seeing across the world is this movement from the hyper-consumption that we saw in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and even 90s, to people saying, you know what, I don't need to own a cow, I just want the milk from the cow, right? And it's the same thing in transportation. People are moving from the me economy to the we economy because of practicality, because it costs a condo. Basically, you can afford another $100,000 in condo in America if you give up your car. That's a big deal. We tend to think of transit as being very, very important because it moves a lot of people. There's no question that it's important for that reason. But the fact is, it creates a place and creates the way of life that we all want and that young people want. Young people are not any different than we were. Now, I was a vice president at Zipcar in the early days. We had no idea it was going to become a billion-dollar company. The smartphone wasn't around yet. It was our partnership with cities that really put us over the tipping point, made us profitable, allowed us to go public, and the whole 9 yards. And now you have the next generation of services, the Olas, the Grabs, the Ubers, the Didis, and they are disrupting more because they've reduced the friction. And people really don't feel like they need to own a car. I would also posit a theory that maybe we don't need to overcomplicate things. Shanghai's got some wonderful bike infrastructure here, bike lanes and so on. When we launched Capital Bike Share in DC and then Divvy in Chicago, people thought, that might be good for tourists. When you make it big and bold, it becomes something that everybody can use as a utility, as transportation. And the public-private partnership aspect was huge when we said, hey, we're going to let the private sector operate this, we'll capitalize it, we'll share the profits, which means we're paddling in the same direction, something that often government contracts don't do, particularly in the United States. And now bike sharing, of course, is all over the world, including in Shanghai. So, let's talk about America for a second. We've got our problems. We have built a culture around the automobile, and it is strangling us, and it is strangling our ability to grow. People are finally waking up, though. They're like, wait a second. You mean I don't really have to go to the gym? I could just ride my bike to work, as people have been doing for over 100 years. Government is getting involved, and government is saying more and more, maybe we should be the travel agent. Maybe we should be the connective tissue, plug in all the public and private options, provide the payment service, deal with the data, right? And aggregate all of that for the customer, which is a very important role. Cities are starting to repurpose space. They're saying, wait a second, where was the streetcar before that we got rid of? Why do we have all that empty space? And I talk about this in my book. And we used to have people-oriented space. This used to be a busy area of the city. Now it's dead. And it's amazing when you take that empty space, or the space that's been given over to automobiles, and you turn it into something else, it gets utilized. And the area regenerates. And you see it right here in Shanghai. I took this picture just the other night. The same sort of temporary pop-up, easy infrastructure. When I got to Chicago, I learned about something called induced demand. And I know we're scared sometimes to have fewer car lanes, fewer parking spaces, right, in our buildings. And the reality is, induced demand says that the more lanes you take away, the more parking spaces you take away, the less of a problem you actually have. This is Market Street in San Francisco, okay? 6-lane road, 2 car lanes with a 10-mile-per-hour speed limit. This is at rush hour. I was in the director's office of the agency, and I said, Ed, where's the traffic? He said, you'd be crazy to drive on this street. This isn't a car street. This is a complete street for people. Everybody's on the trains, they're in the buses, and they're on their bikes. In Tokyo, they've studied this, and they've realized they need to shrink their streets and shrink their intersections if they want to get rid of traffic and if they want to make their streets safer. It's counterintuitive, but highly logical, and the data proves it out. So complete streets, regardless of what the transit mode is, as long as it's high quality, is a real thing. And it's really important, and it's a worldwide phenomenon. And I was in Manila the other day, desperately needed there. I think that it would transform the society and investment potential there if they did. So let's talk about how we get to where at least I think we need to go. We need to go from there to there, or we're going to strangle our cities. For one thing, if you're running a government agency, you used to focus on admirable qualities, but mobility and safety. Now, everything else. Because the choices we make in our transportation network, these are the things that they affect. These are the outcomes. And government needs to be much more focused on outcomes. And so we built very aggressive plans in our cities, often partnering with the private sector to execute. And we tied them to the things that people actually care about. And then we use basic management, which often gets forgotten in big companies and in government, and said, let's make sure we have a timeline in each one of these goals. Let's make sure it's measurable and specific. And then we built sub-plans, and we stuck to our guns, and we stuck to our timelines, and we built hundreds of miles of bike facilities. We saved countless lives with a few $1,000s to enhance intersections, and also make them artistic and interesting, and increase the real estate value in the neighborhood. Sometimes it costs more, $30,000 or $40,000 around a school. But these are simple fixes that change the character of a neighborhood. Or bring back the Barnes dance from the 1940s, which is still used in Tokyo. And complete streets, instituting it within the government and around new developments is very, very important. Whether it's a transit street, whether it's a river on Wacker Drive, or whether it's an alley. Everything needs to be focused on designing around people first. And so when we came out and said we are always going to prioritize the pedestrian, every single thing that we do, I thought we'd get a bunch of backlash. We got none. Zero. Zilch. Nothing but support. So here's the trend in cities. Local streets are shared streets. That's what they should be. Shared between all modes, extremely low speeds, 12 to 17 miles per hour. This is Argyle Street in Chicago. Big streets, your arterial streets, your collector streets, higher speeds, you segregate the traffic. It's really that simple. It's that easy. And you keep it people-oriented. And there are other simple things we can do, like why do we allow big trucks in our cities at rush hour? Then we wonder why it's congested. So there are a lot of simple fixes. So I realized after all this time in the private sector and in startups and then in government, it's really all about change management. And it's about how to build a vision, how to create a sense of urgency around that vision, get it funded, market it to all of your stakeholders, and that fundamentally the other piece is transit-oriented development. And it's worked since 10,000 years ago. It worked in Mari in Syria. It's just they were looking at people's feet and the horse. And now we're looking at trains, and we're looking at autonomous vehicles and so on and so forth. And we have to be honest with people about the true cost of our choices. We think driving's free. It's not free. It's the most costly of all the choices that we make. Because when you invest in walking and biking infrastructure and transit infrastructure, the offsets are so huge, particularly in terms of health costs. When you look at health costs, when I was born, most kids walked and biked to school. Not anymore. And you see the impact. And on a 50-pound child, that's a big difference. And we wonder why in the US, our healthcare costs per capita are double any other country in the world. And we also have to be honest about the fully loaded ROI of transit. Mr. Spire was talking about that earlier. It's hugely, hugely important. When you connect land use and transportation, you realize that the ROI on this versus building another lane of urban highway, there's no comparison. And building a bike lane, by the way, has 60 times the return on investment that one lane of urban highway would be in a city. And now we have design guidelines that were focused on the US, so we can have consistency, but are now launching globally this year. And I'm on the board of NACTO, which is going to probably become GACTO as it goes global. But there are now resources so we don't have to build to a suburban design standard, and we can prioritize people in our right-of-way. The other thing that's very important is that you don't have to build to a gold standard at the beginning. You can try things. You can experiment. And this new quick build approach to infrastructure is hugely important. When you're putting a new building in, if you can't afford the gold standard for a grade separated bike facility, you can still put one in for literally $100,000. And it's amazing, places like Calgary, they put an entire bike network in 1 year for less than $7 million. They can go back and gold plate it later. And we know now that when you create safe places that people want to be, what happens? Real estate values go up, retail goes up, people feel safe. When people feel safe, they actually want to be there. And we're finally having a backlash against what I call stimulus spending on expansion of highways. There's finally a backlash against wasting money, basically. You don't get the ROI that you get from transit or active transportation. And particularly compounded by the fact that young people don't want to drive like they used to. They're not even getting licensed. And the fact that we know that when you build another lane of urban highway, it only works for 2 months. It only increases capacity for 2 months because you're telling people, I want you to drive. And what they've learned in Asia, that I've learned, is there's a difference between spending and investing. And in Shanghai, they're investing. Very dense development around high quality, high capacity transit. Building bike facilities, wider sidewalks, people streets. It's working. So it goes back again to TOD. And we attempted to do some of the same things in Chicago, but on a smaller scale. But they paid huge dividends immediately. The ROI was 10x on this station that we put in the West Loop. So I encourage everybody to look at the fully loaded societal cost of these investments and then what is the actual ROI. In Phoenix, which by the way is a very conservative place, they just self-tax themselves to the tune of $30 billion in a conservative place because they've seen the return on this. So you have mid-sized TOD, right, like bus rapid transit, and I would argue that bike share and some of these easy, modular, solar-powered things that you can put out, and literally you can put a station out in 30 minutes, that functions as TOD. You got to make it dense and you got to make it really big. And in a place like Shanghai, of course, it's got to be 20 times the size of what we're doing in the US. And then you have mega TOD, high-speed rail stations. In Chicago, with our Riverwalk, we used public financing to make the investment. We built it in just a few years, and the private sector stepped up to pay the note for us. Because we talked to them before we put out the RFP, and we figured out that if we could align our incentives, if we could get them excited about this and increase the value of the real estate that they were going to use, then suddenly they were willing to pay for it. And so the whole public-private partnership is changing, and it's becoming more about relationships and understanding, the government actually taking the time to understand the business models of the private sector before they enter into a contract or put out an RFP. And it's a crucial change. And we have got to do this. We've got to change if we're going to save, particularly in the United States, public transit, if we're going to make it viable financially. Somebody was talking earlier on the panel about they weren't sure, I think it was Randy, they weren't sure about whether fixed guideway rail was going to be the future when autonomous cars come. It won't be if it's low quality, that's falling apart, and it can't pay for itself, unlike Hong Kong or Singapore. So let's talk about what's coming. So, you've heard of the Hyperloop. Just a couple years ago, this looked like this silly idea. They're actually building the test tracks right now. They're testing it as we speak. Shervin just put in $80 million. So, I mean, this is a real thing. People still ask me, when are driverless cars coming? I'm like, well, they're already here, actually. The technology's here. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. This is how fast things can change. I advise a lot of cities. A year ago, cities didn't even know really what a smart city was. I mean, sometimes I don't know what it is because it's constantly changing. They didn't know what autonomous vehicles were or when they were coming. The federal government's actually leading in the United States, and through this $50 million Smart Cities competition, you now have 78 cities with business plans for implementation, which, by the way, is a huge opportunity for private companies to come in and do public-private partnerships, because 77 of them are not going to win that money. The vehicles are here, and they're functioning. I had a funny video that wouldn't play because it's on a Mac that shows a guy sleeping in his Tesla as he's driving down the 405. But that's how real it is. Now you have the car companies that are basically weaving together all of their different technologies, starting with cruise control back in the 1970s, collision avoidance, which I have now in my Volvo, to avoid PEDs and bikes. And then you've got Silicon Valley that's really starting from scratch. They don't have the legacy engineering, the supply chains, right? And they have this idea, just remove the human. The human is the fallible part of the equation. The human's the problem. We all think that we love to drive, but we're horrible at it. Let's be honest. So Elon now is saying that cars are going to be outlawed. And somebody mentioned that this morning. I think in cities, yes, that's what's going to happen. In dense urban cores, cars will be outlawed that are driven by people. The other thing that we have to realize is that when vehicle-to-vehicle communication actually happens, which is next year, 2017, most cars will have it, and you layer on autonomous, every vehicle potentially becomes a transit vehicle. Everything. If we have the right software, the right policies. It's a huge opportunity. You see very interesting partnerships, Lyft, actually Didi Quadi, General Motors, transit agencies now partnering with the TNCs, and we just invested actually twice already in Nutonomy, which is a spin-off out of MIT, driverless car company, that moved to Singapore because the government was so friendly to autonomous cars. Isn't that interesting? They moved halfway across the world. And in this latest round that we just invested in, the Singapore government invested. So that tells you something. The nature of the relationship between government and the private sector is changing dramatically. I think that's a good thing. And the innovation, the reason this is going to happen so fast is the innovation is being driven by the private sector. And the impacts are so huge. Government is not going to overregulate this because the impacts are so positive. You're talking about getting rid of 1.1 million of the deaths on the roads over time. You're talking about cutting car ownership rates nearly in half. That's not in dense cities, up to 90% in dense cities. That's gigantic. So my theory is that we're going to look back on this time, out of the 200,000 years we've been on the planet, the 100, not even 100, the 75 that we've been driving cars, and say, that was crazy. What exactly were we thinking? And this rate of change, we are on the precipice of this exponential rate of change. And the change is complex, and the bigger your organization is, the harder it is to deal with it. But being aware of it is key. I can tell you 6 months ago, cities in the US were not at all aware. But I can tell you in 6 months, that's changed completely. So that's how fast this can happen. And I really believe that if the government focuses more on ROI, more on fiscal responsibility, more on cost benefit, and the private sector is going to have to come to the table. These tech companies, in terms of transparency and data sharing, APIs for payment platforms, if they do that, we really have an opportunity. And with smart cities, which is the amalgamation of a lot of these different technologies, it's perfect for public-private partnerships for small companies and big companies and international companies. The cities, though, have got to get out of their silos, and they've got to function autonomously. There's a huge opportunity for developers to unlock an incredible amount of value. Up to 25% of urban cores are parking garages. And within 10 years, we aren't going to need them. Our streets can change dramatically to people-oriented places again as they once were. And we can essentially reshape the cities that we live in. Perkins and Will looked at what would 40th Street in San Francisco look like if we didn't need to park cars. And we could turn it back into park space. There's only one crappy Chevy Chevette from the 1970s on this street. This is what they've been doing in Northern Europe for a long time. And so why don't we start taking the first steps now around our real estate, low-cost improvements for the short term. And longer term, we have to accept that some of the sacred cows, some of the things that we value, that we take for granted over our frame of reference, our short lifetimes, they're going to die. Those things are going to die. And it's not just government that's got to face this. There are entire businesses that are going to go away. When Google and Mercedes and Volvo, who've already announced they're going to self-insure all their vehicles, or at least they'll change. There'll be fleet programs. There are now startups that want to partner with government versus disrupt government, and they want to actually pay people to make the right choices. Because you know why? It's cheaper to pay somebody to get on the bus than it is to build another lane of urban highway. So this is the future, behavioral economics and getting people on transit, on bikes and so forth. And we have to accept that the way people live is going to have to change too. This is a company out of Austin that's building little tiny modular homes and developments around the country, and you buy it once and you take it with you wherever you want to go. It's like IKEA, just plug and play. Another thing I want to mention is future compatibility in design, which we've heard actually about a lot today. If you're building a space, God forbid you're building a parking garage, but if you are, it's got to be flexible, because we don't know how all this stuff's going to shake out. We know the world is changing. There are great suburbs that are urbanizing, that are turning themselves into little cities. We know 3D printing's coming. We heard about that today. We know people are actually building 3D printed homes in Dubai. I think they built this in 17 days for 140 grand, and they cut 50% of the cost. 3D printing is going to change retail, which is already being disrupted in the United States due to Amazon. So it's going to compound it. This company, Local Motors, has actually cut the time to print a car to 22 hours just by upgrading one printer nozzle. So that's the leverage you can get from technology. And food is being grown in much higher quantities now due to companies like Aero Farms coming to cities. And we won't even have to travel anymore at some point. I mean, we will want to travel, but in just a few years, I could beam in here as a hologram. There's a demo outside. Anthony Robbins is already doing this. He's beaming into Sydney or other places from Miami, and it's like he's right on stage. So that will change people's travel habits. And the most important thing is the coming era of free energy. This is going to change everything, and most experts agree it's coming in 25 years. So obviously there's going to be an effect on the way people live and work. And if you talk to the folks at McKinsey, they'll tell you that the way we work is going to dissolve in the next 15 years. And that we need to be more focused on creativity versus STEM. If that's true, and if people are going to be spending more time at home, maybe working from home, maybe working less, where are they going to want to live? They're going to want to live in a beautiful place, in a biophilic city, right? And so there's really a movement towards safety and walkability and access versus ownership to create affordability in cities. By the way, when autonomous cars come and we get rid of parking garages, we should take that opportunity to create affordable housing in cities. So the autonomous car can be a lever, but I don't think we should put all our chips in that basket and think that that's what we're going to use. Because cars are not the answer. We have to admit that that's not working. That's why cities across Europe are banning cars in their urban cores. Will we have grade-separated cities? I hope so, but I hope that the cars go underground, like our plan for Chicago, or what they've done in Dallas, or what Dr. Lee, who's here somewhere in the audience, this is the most amazing project I've ever seen, what he did in South Korea. It's absolutely amazing. And I asked him, how much have the real estate values gone up? He said, a lot. There's another snapshot of that. So we have this huge opportunity. Are we going to create a dystopic future? Are we going to design cities for machines? Or are we going to go back to a simpler time where cities are about people and about nature and about connectivity? And, by the way, in the process, you create a more sustainable business and a lot more revenue. And in the book, I talk about how I think we can get there. We have to get there. We don't have a choice. If we don't make this change, our kids are not going to have a planet to be on. And on top of it, the real estate around the world, in Guangzhou, and in Hong Kong, and in Mumbai, and Osaka, and Shanghai, is going to be devastated by the effects of climate change. That's my daughter. Let's also prioritize policies and technologies on the government side that prioritize happiness in shopping. The US is the richest country in the world. It's 15th on the happiness index. That tells you something, right? And if you're in the private sector, to truly disrupt, let's approach things with a triple bottom line. Because again, instead of quarter-to-quarter profits, we know that creating a sustainable business is a long-term business. In closing, I was out with my friend Mei Wei, he used to run Ford Motor Company in China, and he gave me this quote that I thought was so great, I wanted to read it, from Lao Tzu about water. Water is fluid, soft, and yielding, but water will wear away rock, which is rigid and cannot yield. As a rule, whatever is fluid, soft, and yielding will overcome whatever is rigid and hard. This is another paradox. What is soft is strong. Thank you very much.